Hello, my name is David Detmer. I'm a professor of philosophy at Purdue University Northwest. And this is a talk, Exile or Death, the Case of Socrates. It's part of a series my colleagues and I are doing on philosophy and exile. And I'm going to make a series of videos. This is the first of them about the case of Socrates. And at some point during these videos, I'm going to talk about the relevance of this for us in the 21st century. But first, a little bit about Socrates and the issue of exile. So Socrates was a great philosopher, arguably the first great philosopher in the Western tradition. There are earlier great philosophers in other parts of the world. For example, Confucius in China, who was from the previous century before Socrates. Socrates lived, he was born around 470 BC, died in 399 BC. And he eventually was put on trial, largely for practicing philosophy. He was charged with corrupting the youth of Athens and also impiety for allegedly disbelieving in the official state gods and introducing other gods not recognized by the Athenian state. And it's in that context that the issue of exile came up. The possibility that he might escape a greater penalty of death by instead choosing exile. And later on, after he was sentenced to death, the possibility of escape and going into exile. So I will talk about that in subsequent interviews, in subsequent videos. But for now, let me say a little bit more about Socrates. Like Confucius, he was not a writer. He didn't leave any books behind for us to read and know about his philosophy in that way. Like Confucius, he instead practiced philosophy in conversation. And in particular, it was his habit to wander about in the marketplace of Athens and engage people in conversation about philosophical topics. And typically, the people he would engage in conversation were wealthy and prominent Athenians. And typically, they were quite confident that they had knowledge of whatever topic was going to be discussed. And Socrates would profess his ignorance and say, I'm here to learn from you because I don't understand what justice is or what knowledge is or whatever it might be. And so the way that these conversations would typically unfold is that the person Socrates is talking to would confidently lay out their views. And then Socrates, with great skill, would point out flaws in their position, flaws in their reasoning, logical problems, contradictions, things that were implausible once focused on in a certain way, and so on. And his interlocutors would typically then retreat and say, oh, I see your point, Socrates. I guess maybe what I meant was this. And they'd offer another suggestion, which Socrates would go on to refute. Now, Socrates, although he practiced philosophy and conversation in this way, he was not in any formal sense a teacher. He taught no official courses. He had no students who paid to take courses with him or anything like that. But in an informal sense, he was a teacher and did have students. And these were typically young people who would follow him around and observe these conversations that he had. One of these younger students was Plato, who went on to become another great philosopher. Plato, unlike Socrates, was a writer, and a really wonderful writer. And he wrote his works in dialogue form, where it would be characters, frequently two characters, in conversation, And one of these would be Socrates. And so a lot of what we know about Socrates comes from the writings of Plato. There are other sources as well, but that's one of the main sources. Although, as a kind of footnote, I'll point out that in some of the works of Plato, there's evidence that the views Socrates is expressing are those of Plato himself rather than Socrates. But there are other dialogues where there's good evidence. We're getting the views of the actual historical Socrates. But anyway, getting back to these conversations that Socrates had and the way he attracted students, undoubtedly, one reason why students like to watch, informal students like to watch these discussions was for the philosophy and was for the dialectical skill of Socrates, just as you might enjoy watching, a great athlete or a great singer, someone who was this good at dissecting arguments and showing what's mistaken about them. That's something spectacular to see. But there is maybe a darker side to this as well. You might argue there was a little bit of a bullying aspect to what Socrates was doing, because one gets the impression that, he was self-aware. He understood that he had this great talent. And I think he enjoyed kind of making fools of some of these rather pompous and arrogant, prominent Athenians. And young people, I think, enjoyed seeing that. And that might be one reason that caused resentment against Socrates, which led to him ultimately being prosecuted. Another element might be this. Unlike Confucius, Socrates put forth very few positive points of doctrine. Confucius, if you look at the famous work, The Analects of Confucius, a collection of his sayings put together by his students, Confucius really had a lot of positive points that he wanted to teach, conclusions he had drawn about, how to live, what things are valuable and what things are not, and so on. There's a little bit of that in Socrates, but much more prominent in Socrates is questioning, doubting, refuting. Socrates saying, here's a difficult issue that I don't fully understand. Maybe you do, and you can help me. And then his interlocutor would confidently say, yes, I can help you. And then Socrates would refute it. And so some people are very frustrated by that. They want a positive conclusion, not just a refutation of false ideas. But I would suggest that there is great value in that Socratic kind of project of refutation. And this is a point that can be made about philosophy generally. The great problems of philosophy that people have discussed for centuries, there are many of them where no solution has yet been reached. There's been no argument that has persuaded everyone, or even almost everyone, as to what the right answer is. However, not only Socrates, but many other of the most important philosophers have put forth very compelling and in many cases decisive refutations of views that had initially seemed plausible and were widely accepted, and in some cases are still widely accepted by people not familiar with the history of philosophy. And so I think there is real value in that, a real value in refuting views that can be shown to be wrong, thus clearing the way, sort of narrowing the field, you might say, of plausible contenders. So this might ultimately help us to come to compelling answers. So at any rate, that's a little bit of what was going on that led Socrates to be charged with crimes and put on trial, which ultimately led to the issue of exile. I'm going to conclude this video here And I will talk about the trial of Socrates in the next installment, which I think will be posted a week from today, on a Friday. So I hope you will stay tuned for that one. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you so much for your attention. Take care, everyone.